From the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition, you're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. On today's program, we're going to be talking to a marine scientist turned entrepreneur who's trying to change the way we think about harvesting and eating seafood. That's right after these announcements. The Quivira Coalition will be offering a 2-day workshop in Marfa and Fort Davis, Texas, on March 17th and 18th. Participants will gain hands-on expertise applying compost, biochar, and hay bales to rangeland soils and learn how to monitor the transformative impacts of these applications on water retention, erosion control, and grass production. Participants will also learn how healthy soils strengthen local beef economies and how on-ranch composting and biochar production contribute to mitigating climate change and wildfire risks. Visit quiviracoalition.org/events for more information and to see other upcoming events for this spring, including a multi-part webinar series on carbon credits and a Meat Business Fundamentals series. Quivira Coalition, Quivira, coalition.org/events. Save the dates for New Mexico and Colorado Coalitions to Enhance Working Lands annual summits happening on February 29th in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, and March 21st in Alamosa, Colorado. The summits convene agency and nonprofit staff, private sector professionals, ranchers, farmers, and others for an in-person gathering on collaboration in land stewardship. This year's focus is on agricultural supply chains, from soil health to the processes that bring food and fiber into our communities, and the collaborations that support their strength. It's free to attend, and registration is at nmcewl.org, that's for New Mexico, and cocewl.org for Colorado. It is a great pleasure today to welcome Nick Mendoza. He is founder and CEO of Neptune Snacks, neptunesnacks.com. He's also on the board of the Quivira Coalition. He's the board chairman. Welcome to Down to Earth.
Thanks so much. I'm so pleased to be here.
It's great to have you here. You've got a very interesting story, and I kind of wanted to start with that. You're from a New Mexico cattle ranching family, and now you're working with seafood. I mean, Neptune Snacks is all about fish, and you make a fish jerky, which we'll talk about, but how did you go from A to B, cattle ranching to fish? And what was there something that you took from that background to what you're doing now?
Yeah, that is a big, and that is kind of the whole first question. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I partly grew up on a cattle ranch in the Gila Wilderness, which is and will always be home, roots in New Mexico. But when I was a kid, we actually moved to San Diego for a job my mother got, and I completely fell in love with the ocean, and I've been in love with the ocean ever since. And I think where these two worlds come together, what you've kind of alluded to, is the food system and what the future holds for the food system. So as I got into college and started to pursue what I was most passionate about, the things I think that get me most excited are resource efficiency and regenerative methods of producing food for a growing global population. And when you pair that with the world of the ocean and seafood, how that industry has been mismanaged for such a long time, the opportunity for regenerative practices to quickly restore depleted fisheries, and then a whole nother category of sustainable aquaculture, which is actually, after college, what I went off to study for grad school in Scotland and did research on following that. I think that my roots on a cattle ranch where you can actually, you see where your food is coming from, you understand the resources, the water, the land, and the quality of meat you're getting from a sustainably responsibly raised animal in a category, seafood, that is long overdue for kind of a renaissance and more transparency and a rethink of how the whole global market for it works.
Were your parents doing, maybe they did or didn't call it that, but were they doing what we would now call regenerative cattle ranching?
Yeah, and in fact, the reason I ended up looped in with the Quivira Coalition, which this will be a bit more my backstory, I guess. I left the world of marine science and sustainable aquaculture that I was working with. After grad school, I was doing projects in next generation aqua feeds, and in the meantime...
Aqua feeds?
Yeah, so feeds for the aquaculture industry.
Okay. Like fish food?
That's right. And in fact, that's one of the biggest costs, both in terms of carbon footprint and sustainability and overall operating costs in an aquaculture operation, is the feed. So, especially with highly carnivorous species, which is unfortunately what people tend to want to eat, they have a highly carnivorous diet that is a reduction fishery. So you're using wild-caught sardines, wild-caught anchovies being formulated into feeds. A lot of the work I was doing was with alternatives that were, for example, like microbial-based and plant-based, that would significantly reduce the carbon footprint of the feed in aquaculture, as well as like biometrics work. And we got to do fun stuff like tagging tuna and sharks out at sea. But all that said, so what, in a moment of transition, realizing that research wasn't a path to necessarily directly solving the things I'd seen as huge problems in seafood, which are a lack of traceability to the source, which means a lack of ability for consumers to even know that they're eating unsustainable seafood. In the United States, less than 2% of the fish we eat can be accurately traced to its source. And that's partly because seafood is the most internationally traded food on earth. We export about 80% of what's landed domestically to other markets. We import about 90% of what Americans eat. A lot of that is actually the same fish that was caught in Alaska, sent to China. Some of it was sent back. Some of it was combined with fish from other places, value added, etc.
I mean, made into either just canned or made into other products kind of thing?
In some cases, but in others, it's literally, it was sent over gutted or, frozen into a particular formula, block or canned or etc. And then a big portion of it goes to foreign markets, and then say 20% is sold back to the United States value added. I remember this is actually a pretty formative moment that I had. When I was in Monterey, I was sitting next to the Monterey Bay Aquarium having lunch, and we ordered calamari, and it was the market squid that's caught right in the Monterey Bay. And the waiter said, "Hey, you see that boat out there? It's actually catching the squid that's in your calamari." What he didn't know, and I knew to be true, is that squid is actually being shipped in container ships across the ocean, and then what I just described happens, and some of it comes back. So it's gone twice across the Pacific to land right where it started.
I mean, I know the economics of it work, quote unquote, but it's really hard to understand how it's more efficient to send it to China and send it back than to process it where it is.
I mean, it's hard to grapple with for a lot of reasons, I think. Kind of the simple answer is obviously the cost of labor, but also because the U.S. is bringing in so many goods, it's very inexpensive to ship things out to Asia. So there's a lot of empty containers here. And also, to be perfectly honest, most of the rest of the world values quality and sustainability in seafood a lot more than the average American. So a lot of our really responsible and high quality seafood that's caught in Alaska and in the Northwest, for example, fetches a higher price overseas than here.
One of the things that you and I talked about when we were chatting the other day was that Americans have pretty simple taste in seafood. I mean, it's like tuna, salmon, shrimp, tilapia, maybe one or two other things. Whereas in other countries, there's a much more sort of sophisticated and nuanced set of tastes and desires that people have, and that really affects the way the markets work.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think, one of the difficult things being an innovator and trying to bring new things to the market is contending with norms and existing behavior on the consumer level. So, for example, in Japan, in other parts of Asia, in Scandinavia, there's a pretty widespread established custom of eating dried seafood as snacks, whether it's seaweed or dried ika, squid, or fish jerky, though it wouldn't be called fish jerky there. And it's sort of a leveraging of other trends, in our case, to be bringing a product that is nutritious, sustainable seafood in a shelf-stable, snackable form, as jerky and in the future other on-the-go products. I think in a lot of parts of the world, there's greater familiarity with a broader variety of seafood. And with that comes a broader diversity in the diet of what people are eating. And seafood itself is one of the most diverse food categories. And it's funny that we even call it all seafood, because you've got seaweeds, thousands of species, although there's only a handful that are commercially cultivated and harvested. You've got bivalves, mussels, oysters, clams, etc., crustaceans like shrimp and crabs and all those things we eat. And then
lobsters.
Yeah. And then fish, which is obviously what we work with. And teleost vertebrate fish are the diverse group of vertebrates on Earth. Yeah.
So tell us about Neptune Snacks. What is it? What do you make? How long have you been doing it?
Yeah. So Neptune Snacks, we are makers of Sustainable Ocean Snacks, which for the moment is 4 flavors of fish jerky. We've got a 5th coming out soon. And we've got some other pretty interesting, exciting products in the pipeline too. But the idea behind the brand is to find, the most nutritious, sustainably sourced seafood and bring it in an exciting form into a new category, which is snacking, shelf stable, on the go, and to storytell first and foremost, and to be sourcing from fisheries and sources that have an incredible story to tell. And that's kind of the starting point in how we built the supply chain from my previous experience in marine science. And it's core to, why the brand even exists.
You were saying a moment ago that there were carnivorous fish, and this is something I never really thought about. I mean, we've got animals that we eat that are herbivores. We have animals that are carnivores. They're all mammals. Do you have the same kind of differences in the fish population?
Yeah, I mean, in the marine environment, we have much longer trophic levels. You have the microalgae that are eaten by small plankton and bigger plankton and small fish. And
by the way, ladies and gentlemen, trophic means the food, basically the food chain.
Yes, that's exactly right. Thank you for that. And the interesting thing is, of that list of most consumed American varieties of seafood, a lot of what we eat tends to be really high on the pyramid. So tuna, for example, I had a professor who had a really funny image of there's no equivalent on land for bluefin tuna. The only thing you'd have to have a dragon eater of wolf eaters, because there's so many steps in the pyramid to get to that level of predator that it doesn't even exist on land. And we by and large, luckily, don't eat predators or even harvest wild food as much, at a large scale, the way it's done in the oceans on land. But for historical reasons and taste preferences, it's a lot of what is being taken from the ocean, despite there being hundreds and hundreds of other options, and particularly opportunity to expand beyond this very narrow diet that tends to include pretty carnivorous fish for Americans. But I think in other parts of the world, there are a lot lower trophic level seafood items that are integrated into the daily diet, of the 2+ billion people on the earth that rely on seafood as their primary protein.
Is it more ecologically sound to eat lower on the food chain where seafood is concerned?
Absolutely. And if I was king for a day, I would say everyone on earth should be eating anchovies and seaweed and mussels, for example. Bivalves, which have a net effect of removing nitrogen from the water column, which is awesome, but not king for a day. And I think, people's taste preferences, particularly with seafood, can be finicky. And I guess that brings us back to why jerky and a snack were kind of the trendy solution we came to bring a few species that aren't as commonly consumed or recognized, into people's kind of backpack.
So fill in for us. I mean, you come from a cattle ranch, then you went to college, you studied marine science, you became a researcher. How did you get from there to actually starting this company?
Yeah, so great question. Very pivotal moment in my life and pivotal question in the story, I guess. So I came to realize that the things I was most passionate about in seafood were actually building an industry or change in the industry where there's science at the source. There's management practices that we know work and exist, fisheries management and methods of monitoring that don't exist in most of seafood. How do we actually do something more than publishing a paper or studying what's going on, right, and get people fired up the way I am about, sustainability in seafood and addressing waste in seafood. Most estimates are about half of seafood harvested and processed goes to waste. some point in the supply chain, which is crazy. It's actually not that far beyond produce. There's a lot of waste in produce too, and there's a lot of interesting upcycled ingredients and solutions coming to the table right now. But in seafood, it's everything from bycatch and lost at harvest to processing and spoilage, all the way down to the consumer, where a lot of seafood, at least being sold to consumers in grocery, is fresh, never frozen or thawed on ice, and there's a high rate of spoilage.
Meaning it goes bad in your house.
Yeah. Or, in the grocery store while it's sitting out,
Yeah.
With a very short shelf life. And to that note, immediately frozen at sea or purchased, frozen state is always going to be your tastiest, your highest quality, and ultimately the best. But I think there's this bias that fresh is the best way to go with seafood. But unless you're getting it straight from a fisherman or catching it yourself, there's really very little chance you're getting anything less than 5, 6, 7 days old.
Oh, that's so interesting. So, for example, we have a Trader Joe's here in Santa Fe, and there's a lot of very nice looking frozen fish in there. That's the thing to go for.
Absolutely. That's what I always like to go for is, immediately frozen at sea, and knowing also what it is you're buying and the sustainability background of that.
So you decided that you were going to be an entrepreneur, and you put together a team? Were you just on your own at the beginning? Like, what did that look like?
Yeah, so the transition moment was knowing that I think marine science wasn't my future, and knowing that there were these big problems that I didn't quite understand how to approach yet. But I came back to New Mexico, and I was spending time here. That was when I had a brief stint working for the Quivira Coalition in regenerative agriculture. And on the ranch, we were talking about doing value-added products and maybe direct to market, possibly something like jerky as part of that. And as I started researching the meat snack and jerky market, it was clear there had been a major renaissance already. There were some brands that came forth with natural or regenerative alternatives to the conventional business as usual jerkies and did extremely well. But what I didn't see was anything seafood related in that whole category. And based on what I already knew, there were huge opportunities for a supply chain that would rescue waste, underloved opportunities in seafood, source from MSC certified, highly scoring, sustainable domestic fisheries.
What certified?
MSC, the Marine Stewardship Council certified, is the leading one of a few third-party certifications of sustainability and ethical practices. And, to bring it in a product form that's more approachable than seafood. I think the other really key part of this is that I think pretty much all my adult life I've been Nick the fish guy, because I was obsessed with fish. I love fishing. Growing up in San Diego, I could name, every coastal species that you might come across. And I just got to be known as Nick, the guy who has this unusual infatuation with fish. And that made me kind of a magnet for questions from friends and family. A photo of a grocery, fresh fish counter or a menu saying, hey, I need your help. Am I supposed to order this? Am I supposed to be doing wild salmon, not farmed, right? But we're running out of wild. Which one is it? Also send me a recipe because I don't know. And I got that often enough that it was clear there was purchase intent. People are saying, I'm moving away from, maybe red meat entirely, or trying to add seafood to my diet for whatever reason, whether it's ethical, health, etc., or sustainability. But I don't really know what to do, and I'm scared to cook fish. And I end up buying canned tuna, for example. So it was sort of this confluence of the background I had, and also seeming to realize wow, there's a lot of people who are afraid to handle seafood in their diet, and it's missing from snacking.
Right. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I really admire about people who are entrepreneurs is they can see what's not there. Like, you see that there's all this beef jerky and turkey jerky and so on, but there's not this, you see what's missing. So you decided, okay, we're doing jerky. And then what was the next step?
Yeah, so there was a lot of at-home R&D. So that is literally ordered my little commercial dehydrator. And I'm also, personally, I love to cook, and I've always been interested in food. And part of my graduate school program was actually in food science and a bit of, food formulation and things. But I've kind of approached it like part at-home chef, part scientist, where I had this extremely detailed journal of all the different trials I did, learned as much as I could, made a lot of really, really bad fish leather, accidental fish leather. But kind of this sort of a breakout moment was I got into a program called Fish 2.0. It was like a pitch competition at Stanford. And it was the first time I really kind of was like sticking my neck out with this idea, and this product brought samples. First time anybody outside of my family had really was going to taste it. Pitched on stage, and it went well enough. There's about 300 people in the crowd. Samples were all gobbled up. We ended up getting second in the audience vote of the pitches, and it just felt like enough of a success to call one of my best friends from college, literally on the train coming back from it, ask him to join as a team member, and then get on the process of trying to bring the product to market, which I can get more into. There's a lot of steps there, but yeah, that was the start of beginning to build a team to where we are now and beginning to bring the product to market.
How did you choose? I mean, you use a handful of different kinds of fish in the jerky. How did you choose them? Was it all about sustainability? Are they farmed? Are they wild caught? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we use two species, or one is a group of species, so Pacific rockfish and wild Alaska pollock. We started with the rockfish, and I tested dozens and dozens of locally available West Coast fish that kind of fit the model and were whitefish, both because that produced something that was much more similar in taste and texture to a traditional beef jerky, but also because of some of the sustainability stuff we're talking about. And rockfish, the reason I was so excited for that to be our first product line is that they have a story. The New York Times called it the greatest conservation success story you've never heard of. Essentially, this rockfish kind of describes a complex of about 70 species of rockfish, widow, yellowtail, China, etc., that were severely impacted up until the 70s and 80s via overfishing because of a lack of management and science in place. But they basically shut the fishery down as a failed, collapsed fishery. But at that point, they brought in policymakers, fishermen, advocacy groups to the table to try to put together a method of management that would create a fishery that would be sustainable for the next 1,000 years, was kind of how it was quoted. And the catcher system that was put in place, obviously nothing's perfect, especially when you're going out and catching wild things, but recovered all the individual species, many of them 20 years ahead of schedule, 30 years ahead of what they predicted with science would be the timeline to recovering the biomass, the populations. And I think the reason that resonates so much with me is that it's something that could be possible in so many other cases of depleted global fisheries when you have the right pieces and you have the right factors at play. And for that to be a lesson and also a testament to the fact that, there's huge opportunities to change the tides for the direction of global wild-caught fisheries. And then at the same time, there's aquaculture that is a quickly growing and also quickly innovating and improving space. So that was, this story of recovery and success was really exciting with the rockfish. The wild Alaska pollock, larger fishery from the Bering Sea in Alaska, we were presented with basically this third-party assessment of its carbon footprint and its management. And I was kind of blown away by one fact, and that's that the carbon footprint pound for pound within this fishery is about half that of tofu, pound for pound, and 1/5 of a Beyond Burger. Exactly, yeah. So, whereas the rockfish is more of, a small boat operated single boat fishery, these are at sea processors, so it's all frozen at sea and processed. So it's a larger scale fishery, yet they're harvesting 15% of the biomass every year. There's observers on every boat. There's science. There's stopgaps to make sure that if there's ever a low yield year, there's courses of action to make sure that the sustainability fishery is maintained. Low bycatch, all the, anything that comes on that's bycatch is counted and with the fisheries observers in place. So
bycatch meaning fish that aren't what you're fishing for.
Exactly,
or
yeah.
Other beings that you're not fishing.
Non-target species, etc., which is one of the biggest sustainability issues in large-scale and unmanaged fisheries like open seas, fisheries where you have longliners catching, just innumerable cormorants and sharks and things that are horrible. So that piece of it to say, this is an extremely carbon-friendly protein in a fishery that's doing well and growing as biomass over time. And if you compare it to other proteins, there's no freshwater use, no arable land use, no fertilizer, other inputs that you have on land, no fertilizer runoff into the Gulf of Mexico and into the marine environment. All these things that at the end of the day are part of the resource efficiency or inefficiency of our food. And I think that's something that most people don't consider in their food choices. And obviously, all of this is, there's trade-offs to everything. No food production system, even regenerative farming or ranching, is perfect. But when you consider the alternatives and the trajectory, I think that's something I want to be talking about.
When you were talking about the rockfish story and how the populations recovered so much quicker than people thought, it's kind of the flip side of a lot of the stories that we get in the media about climate change, like things are declining so much quicker than we thought. And it's really interesting to know that the good side can move just as quickly.
Yeah, in at least this case, and I think in a lot of cases it can. Something I like to sort of bring to light, as somebody who has a background in biology, most things that we eat from the ocean we call R strategy organisms, so exponential growth. A female tuna, sexually mature female bluefin tuna might release 2 million eggs in a reproductive cycle. Obviously, a very, very small number of those grow to adulthood, but under the right conditions, in the right circumstances, you can see really quick resurgence and recovery of these populations. There's not much that we eat on land. I mean, insects have that reproductive strategy. Right. So that's sort of the equivalency. It's, if elephants or other mammals on Earth, it might take 1,000 years to recover the number of individuals, even under 100% protection. But there's this opportunity for quick recovery because of the nature of their biology, but not when we're, overexploiting and commercial fishing is not giving them a chance.
Talk a little bit more about, in terms of sustainable fisheries, what constitutes a sustainable fishery? And of course, a fishery is not monolithic. There's lots of different fish. It's an ecosystem with lots of different creatures, and they all interact and they're all part of the same system. But what makes it healthy, and what does it take to keep it sustainable when there are these, markets for fish and for other products from the sea that we eat? What kind of policies do we need, and do those policies exist?
Such a big question.
I know, sorry.
No, but it is an important one, and it's sort of the heart of a lot of this. Seafood in general, the last wild food on Earth that we eat at a large scale, which is kind of an interesting piece of it. And, in that comes a high degree of international trade. We're eating a lot of fish that's coming from the South China Sea or the Indian Ocean, places like that, where, again, there's a real lack of traceability to the source or ability to understand the necessary details of the source. So by and large, I think a lot of your viewers have probably heard a lot about the state of the oceans, large degree of overfishing. They've kind of never been in a worse place in terms of overfishing. Yet there are golden examples of proper management and the right pieces being put in place to both recover and manage a fishery. So those things that you were asking specifically, what needs to be in place, what constitutes a sustainable fishery, I think square one is science at the source and management to know, okay, what is the status of it? What is, conceivable sustainable yield? How many fish are even being harvested from it, or whatever the species being taken is? And how do we track that over time to be sure that if we're looking down the road that we're not putting the sustainability of the fishery in jeopardy? You want it to grow or at the very least remain the same over time with what's being harvested from it. Without that data at the source, it's impossible or very difficult to do that.
So science is a big piece, and I would imagine it's tricky to know what that ecosystem ever was in a natural state.
Yeah, exactly.
Before people started messing with it.
Yeah, I think that's That's an excellent point, and probably not dissimilar from what we could say about land. If you even just look at farming and ranching in North America, we think that the timeline started when Europeans arrived and started grazing cattle to a large degree. But, this is a highly transformed landscape for tens of thousands of years, really, but
right.
bigger topic.
Yeah, well, and I mean, and a piece of it also is that there are other mammals, there are other creatures that eat fish. It's not just for us. In other words, seals and walruses and dolphins and whales, they all need to eat. Yeah,
and in the Pacific Northwest, so Neptune is Seattle-based, there's, a big controversy and question about the orcas native and local to the Puget Sound, who feed primarily on king salmon, which is one of the species that has not been returning in the numbers historically, and they're in real trouble. And that's been a topic that, is front page of the Seattle Times, that level of prominence.
So what kinds of policies do we need to make? I mean, you start with the science so that you have good and trackable data about your fishery, but then what?
Yeah, I think the next step and the crucial one is traceability. That is, seafood being this opaque food system where there's an average of, I think, 6 or 7 buyers and sellers in a supply chain of most of the imported seafood we're getting. There's huge incentive and opportunity for mislabeling, either with fish that are from another source or even different fish entirely, especially when you're talking about whitefish. There's been a couple large-scale studies done that showed massive amounts of fraud in seafood.
Wow.
Yeah. So most famously, there was an Oceana study a few years ago, but I've even come across a couple podcasts in the last couple weeks or months talking about you're buying fish that's being sold as Pacific snapper or something higher value, and it's really maybe a farmed pangasius from Vietnam, because there's huge economic incentive to sell the product as something else. And oftentimes at the end of the supply chain, restaurants or other retailers don't even know that they've bought something that isn't what it claims to be. So without traceability, we don't have a solution. So I think, on a policy front, we have the technology for traceability. It exists in most of the food system. Everything that we source is traceable to the moment it was taken from the water and processed, because it's in place for reasons of food safety and also for these reasons of tracking what fish are being harvested at, in what FAO fishery ground, etc. But that becomes extremely difficult given the internationality of seafood. But the technology does exist, and there's some pretty interesting startups and other players coming in to try to create solutions where you can't adulterate and bring fraud into these supply chains. My feeling, and part of the reason I got into Neptune, was that for it to be something that policy begins to solve, there needs to be enough consumer demand and interest to make a change.
And are you seeing that?
Even just in the few years that we've been doing this, we've been on the market about 4 years, both the sophistication of the average consumer's knowledge on seafood and the problems, and the way they go about making their purchasing decisions, I think has changed dramatically, which is exciting. It's
interesting.
All things take time, but something I kind of like to say is it really feels like seafood is like the coffee industry before fair trade.
Okay.
Where it's like most people are aware there are problems, some big problems, with ethical sourcing, etc. They're not really sure what they are. They also have no idea how to differentiate between something that is ethically sourced or not. But fair trade for coffee basically created this, it served as almost a new gatekeeper in that the price of doing business is now traceability and understanding of what you're doing at the source. And obviously in coffee, that's blossomed hugely. And again, none of these things are perfect, but I think some sort of next step where we create a barrier to selling unsustainable, untraceable seafood without certain credentials and certain levels of traceability would make a huge difference.
There's 2 other things that come to mind. One of them is pollution and making sure that your fish are coming from clean waters and aren't eating things that are really bad for them and therefore for you. And then the other thing is unsustainable harvesting practices, like scraping the whole entire seabed or
yeah, exactly.
Things like that.
Yeah, and that kind of touches back on, we brought up MSC, the Marine Stewardship Council, earlier. They're one of a number of certification. There's also recommendation schemes like the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch program.
That's an app that a lot of people have on their phones.
Yeah, and I think they've made some pivots and changes to the way they run their program, but they're trying to use these pieces of like, what's the harvest method, what's the depth of data and science at the source. Can we quantify things like unintended predator interactions, or sharks ending up in nets, or dolphins ending up in nets of a tuna fishery, all this sort of things, give it a direct score, and only certify the fisheries and the operations that are meeting a standard that we can feel pretty good about calling sustainable.
And then that people know that when they're in the market.
Yeah, exactly. It's a label that goes on the package.
Yeah.
And again, there's a number of them out there. There's ones for aquaculture as well. And these are steps toward creating the guidelines that I think consumers need, because it's impossible for a consumer to know or understand what they're looking at or sourcing. Even people who know seafood really well, it's really difficult to know what you're getting.
Totally.
Yeah.
One of the things that we talk about a lot in terrestrial agriculture is buying local. What does local mean, if anything, in the seafood industry? I mean, considering that you and I are sitting here in New Mexico, we're not, I guess there might be some local river fish or whatever, but, local is not even an option.
Yeah, I mean, with seafood, really, it's different from other food in so many ways. Again, most internationally traded food, because just the nature of the global oceans. I think a good thing to keep in mind is that the U.S. has some of the best managed domestic local fisheries in the world. Alaska has, by and large, been a poster child in the way they manage fisheries. Obviously, nothing's perfect, but
is there, the way there is in meat and produce and so on, a concept of local in seafood?
I would say it's quite different. Obviously, if you live on a coast and you can buy fish on the dock from a fisherman, that's perfect and that's lovely, especially if you know exactly the capture method, where it's coming from. But for most people, that's not an option and not realistic. I think I would define local and kind of use the term loosely. It's like, know where it's coming from, know the metrics and the details of the source and the sourcing. And
know that it's coming to you on a truck from somewhere else.
Yeah, for the most part. Especially with what we were discussing earlier, immediately frozen at sea, it's been stabilized in that way. The carbon footprint piece of it, obviously, as much as possible, limiting, the cold chain and the distance that it's traveling. But there is kind of a reality that's, it's got to come from the oceans. Ideally, if you're in the Northeast or in the Northwest, you're getting local black cod or Dover sole or things that are being caught by your local fishermen. The other part of that is that you need to be open to a bit more exploration in your species selection, things that maybe you've never heard of or aren't on that top list of most consumed seafood items.
What are some of the ones that you've discovered that are like that?
Yeah, so I just mentioned one, sablefish, black cod in the Northwest. Oh, it's got to be the most delicious fish in the world. It's very buttery and fatty and does really well in like a miso sake glaze. And it's caught off the coast of Oregon, Washington, Alaska, mostly hook and line and cage, like submerged cage traps. Some species in the West Coast groundfish complex, which is the rockfish is part of that, obviously. Rockfish is a wonderful fish. I think it's delicious. It's like your perfect quintessential white fish in a lot of ways. And it astounds me that people that live in California and Oregon and Washington aren't familiar with it. It's one of our most abundant nearshore groups of species, as well as various flounders, yellowfin flounder, etc., which most people know halibut. These are just little versions that come right off the bone when you cook them, are really delicate and delicious.
One can tell that you're a cook.
I try, a lot of people turn to me for seafood specifically, and I do love cooking. Amateur cooking.
Yeah, well, people might buy certain kinds of wine because they like a certain vineyard in California or certain kinds of cheese from Vermont or from Holland or whatever, and maybe even certain kinds of olive oil or whatever. Does that kind of specificity exist, or do you hope to cultivate something like that in fish, in seafood?
Yeah, that's a really good parallel to draw. And there is a facet of seafood that I think you can draw a parallel from. Tin fish and canned seafood items has been having a moment recently. A good friend of mine, I'm going to give a shout out, Becca at Fishwife. They just got a Shark Tank deal, and they've kind of been one of a few brands revitalizing that category with bright, fun packaging and bringing things like anchovies to Gen Z consumers. But within that category, it's one where there's a lot of, Portuguese sardines or squid from, the Mediterranean.
So it's happening.
Yeah, to a degree, I guess. I don't know that it could ever be like what we see in wine or,
Right.
A semi more luxury market. But there's also a greater and greater interest, I think, from consumers in like trying to find local fish and understanding, what they can get seasonally and from somewhere that isn't across the ocean. Certainly I feel that. And again, I get a lot of questions from friends and family as to what they should be eating. But I think things are looking to be going in the right direction, but it's a lot of information, to ask the average consumer to keep in their brain.
I just gonna put in a plug for anchovies. They're so good.
I
The
love
other night,
anchovies.
I was hungry at 11 o'clock at night and, made just a little thing with garlic, anchovies, capers, a little olive oil, and you put it over spaghetti.
Oh, it's so good.
It's so good.
I love all tin fish.
Yeah.
I used to get in trouble with my dorm neighbors in college in my freshman dorm because I would eat a lot of like smoked trout. That was my favorite snack, open up some crackers and you'd smell that up and down the hallway. So I was that guy, but God, it's so delicious and not to mention nutritious with omega-3s, and it's really
That's something we haven't talked about, and I think that's very important, is the health benefits of seafood.
Yeah, so I think most people have heard of omega-3s and the positive benefits for your brains and joints and other things. And seafood is one of the best places we can get that, from seaweed all the way up to your fin fishes. Our product has actually 450 to 580 omega-3s between the two source species and 25 grams of protein in just a 2.25 ounce pouch, which is incredibly protein dense. It also is a great source of a lot of micronutrients and vitamins. It's vitamin D. We've even got selenium, which a lot of people aren't aware of, and there's not many places to get selenium in your diet, but more and more studies are showing a vast variety of health benefits to it. It's not something we ever market on because it's not something that is accessible to really communicate about, but seafood is it's a really nutritious category as a whole.
What's your kind of longer term vision when you see the society that we're living in and the world that we're living in crisis, climate crisis, food system crisis on multiple levels, population crisis, if you want to even talk about that? What do you see the role of seafood in that?
Yeah, so man, we're getting to the heart. If I could do anything in the next couple years of my life and career, I think tackling food waste across our food system is a really low-hanging fruit, just because there's so much of it and there's so many opportunities. It's a triple bottom line, right? Because food waste is also economic waste. And a lot of that is just, it hasn't been important enough, or there hasn't been enough financial incentive until recently to target some of these waste streams. I'm generally part of the Upcycled Food Association, and there's some really awesome brands that are part of that, using, for example, pulp from juiceries that would have otherwise gone to waste, and making really nutritious, fibrous crackers and chips and things. It's my friend Caitlin at Pulp Pantry. And there's a whole number of other, there's one using the fruit from coffee plantations in products that otherwise, they said, they would visit plantations where it was being thrown in the river because it's not part of what's, the product being harvested. In seafood, we've already talked about the degree of waste streams. And I think for the amount of effort it would take to begin chipping away at some of these, there's a huge return on it and environmental benefit, especially when you consider that food is the biggest greenhouse gas contributor globally. Yeah, so I think our model, directly taps into waste streams and talks about, how this takes place and why it's important. I think it's just, even if my company scaled beyond our wildest dreams, it would still be the smallest drop in the bucket for what needs to happen. It's more about awareness and others taking up the torch to do similar work to try to approach these supply chains.
So it's probably about time to wrap up, but where can people get Neptune Snacks? I mean, you can go to neptunesnacks.com, but are they available in stores?
Yeah, so we're in close to 2,000 stores across the country. Those are mostly along the West Coast and in the Northeast. So depending on where you are, I think the easiest way is always going to be online on our website or Thrive Market or Amazon. But within cities like Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, we're at your PCCs and your nicer co-ops and places like that. A few convenience chains like Bartell's and places like that. But depending on where you are, I think online is always a good place to go.
Anything else that we haven't mentioned that you want to make sure to talk about before we go?
I guess the one thing I would say is that it's easy to get caught up in a lot of doom and gloom and, the direction of the climate crisis and so many other problems that are front and center in our lives every day. And I think there's also a lot of things to be optimistic about and a lot of opportunities to vote with your dollar and be a part of, a better way of doing things. And that's where we should focus our energies, right? Because what else can you do? And I think that there's both personal benefit and greater collective benefit in taking that approach.
And that's really what we try to do on this podcast. And we say the Down to Earth is a podcast about hope. And, this is all part of that, like looking at what we could do in the face of that doom and gloom.
Absolutely. And I'm so pleased to have been here. Seems like the right home to be telling a little bit of a story about what we do.
Nick Mendoza, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.